They built an American empire on beer and land. Then they walked away from both. The Busch family didn't lose Anheuser-Busch in a crash. They sold it for $13 billion. They didn't lose Grant's farm in foreclosure. They donated it. And yet today, the family that once defined St. Louis wealth no longer controls the company, no longer lives on the estate, and no longer operates as the dynasty it spent a century becoming. The question isn't what they lost. It's why ownership stopped being protection. Because when you control that much, the wealth doesn't just sit there. It has operating costs. Legal exposure. Tax obligations that compound annually. And the moment you stop being the person who understands the system better than the system understands you, the structure starts to win. In 1876, Adolphus Busch didn't inherit a brewery. He married into one, then rebuilt it with his own capital and distribution genius. Eberhard Anheuser, his father-in-law, ran a struggling St. Louis brewery that was on the edge of failure. Adolphus saw what Anheuser couldn't, that beer was about to become a national product, not a local craft. He introduced pasteurization to American beer, making it stable enough to ship across state lines without spoiling. He created refrigerated rail cars when most breweries were still delivering by horse cart. He built bottling plants in cities where his competitors were still filling growlers at the tavern. Budweiser wasn't just popular. It was infrastructure. By the time Adolphus died in 1913, Anheuser-Busch was producing more than 1 million barrels annually, employed thousands, and had distribution networks that reached from New York to California. The family wasn't just wealthy. They were generating industrial-scale cash flow in an era when income tax didn't exist and regulations were minimal. That kind of wealth doesn't just accumulate. It creates expectations. It creates visibility. And it creates the need to perform power in ways that make the family's status undeniable. That's when they bought the land. Grant's farm wasn't farmland. It was 281 acres of Missouri River Valley property that Ulysses S. Grant had once worked as a struggling farmer before the Civil War made him a president. The Busch family didn't need it for agriculture. They built it as a private kingdom. A place where wealth could be performed, where politicians and executives could be entertained in a setting that made the family's power feel organic, historical, almost aristocratic. They stocked it with buffalo, elephants, zebras. They built riding stables that housed championship horses. They maintained full-time veterinary staffs, groundskeepers, and private security. The estate became a symbol. But symbols cost money to maintain. And that's the part most people miss. When you own an estate like that, you're not just paying property taxes. You're paying for roads, utilities, groundskeeping, veterinary staff, liability insurance on rare animals, workers' compensation for dozens of employees, environmental compliance because you're housing endangered species. You're running a private zoo that generates no revenue. The wealth has to be large enough that the estate is a rounding error. The moment it stops being a rounding error, it starts being a problem. If you're watching this and starting to realize that scale doesn't simplify wealth, it complicates it, you're seeing what most people never do until it's too late. By the 1920s, the Busch family faced the first structural test, prohibition. The Volstead Act didn't just ban alcohol. It eliminated the entire legal framework that Anheuser-Busch had been built on. Most breweries collapsed within 2 years. The Busch family survived by pivoting to near beer, a legal low-alcohol beverage that tasted like failure but kept the production lines running. They also diversified into refrigeration, yeast production, and ice cream. They kept the workforce employed. They kept the brand alive. And the moment Prohibition ended in 1933, they were the only major brewery with intact infrastructure. That's what separates dynasties from lucky families. Dynasties survive the structural collapse that kills everyone else. But survival has a cost. The pivot required loans. It required renegotiating supplier contracts. It required laying off workers and then rehiring them, which meant union negotiations and labor disputes. The family wasn't just managing wealth anymore. They were managing political relationships, legal battles, and a workforce that now had organizing power. The business was becoming too complex for family intuition to manage alone. August Busch Sr. took over after Prohibition. He understood that the company needed to professionalize. He brought in external managers. He implemented cost accounting. He standardized production processes that had previously been run by brewmasters who worked on feel and tradition. He turned Anheuser-Busch into a corporation that happened to be family-owned, rather than a family business that happened to be large. That shift is invisible to most people. But it's everything. Because the moment you professionalize, you're admitting that expertise matters more than bloodline. And once you admit that, the family's control starts eroding from the inside. August Busch Jr. took over after World War II. He was aggressive, competitive, and obsessed with market dominance. Under his leadership, Anheuser-Busch didn't just grow. It weaponized marketing. The Clydesdales weren't mascots. They were brand infrastructure, introduced in 1933 as a celebration of Prohibition's end and then maintained at enormous cost because they created emotional association that no advertisement could replicate. The sponsorship of sports wasn't charity. It was market capture. By the 1970s, Budweiser wasn't competing with other beers. It was competing with Coca-Cola for the identity of American refreshment. And it was winning. But winning at that scale requires different talent. It requires financial strategists who understand currency hedging, tax attorneys who can navigate multi-state regulatory environments, compliance teams who can interpret FDA and ATF regulations that change annually. The family wasn't just running a company. They were managing a public entity with shareholders, quarterly earnings calls, and fiduciary duties that didn't care about legacy. And the more successful the company became, the more it required people who understood modern corporate finance better than the family did. That's the trap. You can build an empire on vision and risk. But once it's built, it requires maintenance skills you probably don't have. August Busch III took over in 1975. He was even more aggressive than his father. He expanded globally, entering markets in China, Brazil, and Europe decades before craft beer made international competition normal. He diversified into theme parks, buying SeaWorld and Busch Gardens, believing that family entertainment and beer shared demographic synergy. He turned Anheuser-Busch into a Fortune 500 juggernaut with revenue exceeding $15 billion annually by the late 1990s. But diversification doesn't reduce risk when you don't understand the sectors you're entering. Theme parks have liability exposure breweries don't. They have seasonality. They have safety regulations that require constant capital expenditure. Every roller coaster is a mechanical system that can fail. Every animal show is a potential OSHA violation. And when you own them outright instead of licensing the brand, every incident is your incident. In 1999, a woman died on a roller coaster at Busch Gardens, Williamsburg. The lawsuits didn't just target the park. They targeted the parent company. And because the Busch family were the public faces of that parent company, they were named personally in depositions. Wealth doesn't protect you from legal discovery. It makes you a more attractive target. If you've ever wondered why billionaires suddenly start moving assets into trusts or why they stop being the CEO and become the chairman emeritus, this is why. The estate, meanwhile, was becoming a liability in ways the family hadn't anticipated. In 1954, they had opened parts of Grant's farm to the public as free tours, partly to improve the family's image during a period of labor disputes, partly because the exotic animals were expensive to maintain and public access created a justification for the cost. But the moment you open private land to the public, you assume liability. Every visitor is a potential slip-and-fall lawsuit. Every animal interaction is a regulatory inspection. The insurance premiums alone were running into the hundreds of thousands annually by the 1980s. And here's the mechanism most people miss: the estate wasn't owned by the family directly. It was held in a family trust, which meant it had trustees, legal obligations, and beneficiaries who all had to agree on major decisions. When August Busch III wanted to sell a portion of the land for development in the 1990s to offset costs, other family members blocked it, arguing it would damage the legacy. The wealth was technically theirs, but the control was distributed. And distributed control means no one can act decisively. That's what kills dynasties. Not external enemies. Internal gridlock. By the early 2000s, Anheuser-Busch was still enormously profitable, generating over $2 billion in net income annually. But profit and control are not the same thing. The company was publicly traded, which meant the family's shares could be diluted. It meant activist investors could push for restructuring. It meant private equity firms could quietly accumulate stock and then demand a seat at the table. The Busch family still held roughly 5% of shares, which sounds significant until you realize that means 95% was held by people who didn't care about legacy. And in 2008, that's exactly what happened. InBev, a Brazilian-Belgian conglomerate formed from the merger of Interbrew and Ambev, made an unsolicited offer to buy Anheuser-Busch for $52 billion. It wasn't a friendly negotiation. It was a hostile takeover attempt. InBev went directly to shareholders, bypassing the board initially, and made the case that Anheuser-Busch was underperforming relative to its market position. They pointed to operating margins that were lower than European competitors. They pointed to legacy costs like the Clydesdales and the theme parks that didn't generate proportional returns. They made the business case that the Busch family was a cost center. The family could have fought it. But fighting a hostile takeover requires more than money. It requires board unity, shareholder loyalty, legal strategies like poison pills or white knight buyers, and a plan to generate better returns than the acquisition price. They didn't have any of those things. The board, filled with external directors who had fiduciary duties to shareholders, accepted the offer. The shareholders, who wanted the premium price, approved. And the family that had controlled the company for 156 years walked away with a payout. $13 billion sounds like victory. But it's not control. And control is what they'd spent a century building. Here's what happens after a sale like that. The payout isn't a lump sum. It's structured. Some of it is stock in the acquiring company, which means you're now holding shares in a foreign entity that might not perform. Some is cash, but distributed over years to avoid flooding the market. Some is subject to performance earnouts, meaning if the acquired company doesn't hit targets, you don't get the full amount. And the moment you're holding that much liquidity, the tax burden becomes enormous. Capital gains tax at the federal level is 20%. State taxes add another 5 to 10% depending on jurisdiction. Estate taxes, if the wealth is transferred to the next generation, take another 40%. The IRS doesn't wait. Estate planners, wealth managers, and attorneys all take their percentage. And if the family members aren't unified on how to manage it, the wealth fragments. Because here's the thing about generational wealth, it's not one pile of money. It's 100 smaller piles, each controlled by a different family member with different priorities. One wants to reinvest in new beverage ventures. Another wants to liquidate and live off the interest. Another wants to donate it for tax advantages and legacy reputation. Another wants to fund a political career. And the moment those priorities diverge, the family stops being a dynasty and becomes a collection of rich individuals who happen to share a name. That's what happened to the Busches. Some family members reinvested in craft breweries, trying to recapture the entrepreneurial energy the original Adolphus had. Others went into real estate, buying commercial properties in St. Louis and other cities. One started a cryptocurrency venture that failed within 3 years. Another focused on philanthropy, endowing university programs and medical research facilities. They didn't lose the money. They stopped being a unified entity. And the estate that had once symbolized that unity became too expensive to maintain without the corporate resources that used to subsidize it. Because Grant's farm wasn't just expensive. It was legally complicated. It had endangered species permits from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which required annual inspections and compliance reports. It had historical preservation obligations because parts of the property included structures from the Grant era, which meant any renovations required approval from heritage boards. It had public access agreements because the family had opened it for tours, and reversing that would have triggered lawsuits from tourism boards and conservation groups that had promoted it for decades. And the moment you open private land to the public, you assume liability. Every visitor is a potential lawsuit. Every animal is a regulatory inspection. Every structure is a maintenance cost that can't be deferred without risking citations. By 2016, the calculation was clear. The estate was costing more to maintain than the family was willing to spend. But selling it was politically impossible. The Busch name was still associated with St. Louis. The estate was still a tourist attraction. Selling it to a developer would have destroyed the family's remaining social capital in the city. So they did the only thing that made sense from a tax and liability perspective: they donated it. If you're starting to feel like the system is designed to outlast the people who think they own it, you're not wrong. The family transferred Grant's farm to a nonprofit trust. Not sold. Donated. Which tells you everything. If the estate had been easy to monetize, they would have sold it. If it had been cheap to maintain, they would have kept it. Instead, they handed it to a structure that could carry the liability and the tax obligations without expecting a return. Here's the mechanism most people miss. When you donate property to a nonprofit, you get a tax deduction based on the appraised value. But that deduction is only useful if you have equivalent income to offset. The Busch family didn't have corporate income anymore. They had capital gains and investment returns, which are taxed differently and have caps on deductions. So the deduction was worth less than it appeared. And the estate, once transferred, could never be reclaimed. It wasn't a strategy. It was an exit. The family didn't leave because they were broke. They left because the cost of staying was higher than the value of the symbol. And that's the part that reframes everything. We think of estates and empires as assets. But they're also obligations. They require legal teams, insurance, staffing, compliance. They require someone in the family to care enough to manage them. And when the generation that built the empire dies, the next generation inherits the cost without inheriting the psychological need to preserve it. August Busch IV, the last family CEO, didn't lose his position because he was incompetent. He lost it because the board decided the company needed someone who understood global consolidation better than family legacy. And when InBev took over, they didn't keep him in a ceremonial role. They restructured. They cut costs. They eliminated the Clydesdale breeding program as a standalone division. They moved headquarters operations to New York and then to Belgium. The Busch name stayed on the label, but the family stopped being operationally relevant. That's not failure. That's replacement. The estate is still there. Visitors still tour it. The Clydesdales are still stabled on the property. But the family doesn't live there. They don't control it. And most of the tourists who visit don't realize that the dynasty ended not with a crash, but with a quiet legal transfer that made the cost someone else's problem. This is what generational wealth actually looks like in the long term. It doesn't vanish. It diffuses. The individuals stay rich. But the structure that made them a dynasty disappears. And the things they built to symbolize permanence, estates, companies, brands, outlast them not because they were protected, but because they were handed off. If you've made it this far, you're seeing something most people never stop to analyze. Wealth isn't just about accumulation. It's about whether the next generation understands the systems well enough to keep it, or whether they're just holding it until the professionals take over. There are other families like this. The Vanderbilts built estates they couldn't keep. Biltmore, the largest private home in America, is now a tourist attraction run by a corporation. The Guggenheims built museums that replaced their businesses. The Hearsts built castles that became state parks. In every case, the wealth was real. But the structure was temporary. Because systems evolve faster than families do. Tax codes change. Corporations professionalize. Markets consolidate. And the skills that let you build an empire in 1876 are not the skills that let you keep it in 2008. The Bush family wasn't destroyed by bad luck. They were outpaced by structural complexity. And the estate they walked away from is the clearest proof. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a legal entity with operating expenses and regulatory exposure. And the moment maintaining it required more expertise than nostalgia, it stopped being theirs. That's not a tragedy. That's a design feature. The professionals won. The systems won. The institutions that could carry long-term liability without emotional attachment won. And the family that thought ownership was permanent learned the same lesson every dynasty eventually learns: you don't own things that last longer than you do. You just manage them until someone more structurally equipped takes over. The beer is still everywhere. The name is still on the label. The Clydesdales still appear in commercials. But the people who built it aren't the people who run it. And the land they once ruled is now a non-profit asset that generates educational value instead of family power. This is how empires end in America. Not with revolution. Not with scandal. With lawyers, tax structures, and a board meeting where someone decides the family's time is over. And if that makes you rethink what it means to build something that lasts, then you're understanding what the Bush family didn't until it was too late. Ownership is temporary. Systems are permanent. And the only thing wealth guarantees is that when you stop being useful to the structure continues without you.